I never thought my breaking point would come during a family dinner, but that's exactly how it happened. The sound of my mother-in-law's fork scraping against her plate was like nails on a chalkboard, each screech matching the tension headache building behind my eyes. My name is Marin, and until recently, I thought I was living the life I was supposed to want. Nice house in the suburbs, successful husband, beautiful daughter. But that night, something inside me finally cracked. "Sophie, sit up straight," Bernice commanded from across the table. My 6-year-old daughter's shoulders hunched further, her small fingers fidgeting with her napkin. "Really, Marin, you should work on her posture. A young lady needs to learn these things early." I watched Sophie's face fall, noticed how she started to withdraw into herself, the way she always did before her stutter kicked in. "She's fine, Bernice. She's just tired from school. Please, may I be excused?" Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, my husband Nolan cut in. "No one's excused until they finish their dinner. And Sophie, we've talked about that stutter. You need to try harder." I gripped my knife tighter, knuckles white against the sterling silver. "She doesn't need to try harder. She needs support and maybe some professional help," which I've been saying for months. "Professional help?" Bernice's eyebrows shot up as she exchanged a look with Nolan. "In my day, we didn't run to therapists for every little thing. Children just need proper discipline." "Well, this isn't your day anymore, is it?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, sharper than I intended. The silence that followed was deafening. Nolan's jaw tightened, that familiar warning sign I'd learned to fear over the years. "Marin, a word in the kitchen." "Now." I followed him, feeling Bernice's smug satisfaction radiating from the dining room. As soon as we were alone, Nolan turned on me. "What's gotten into you lately? You're embarrassing me in front of my mother." "I'm embarrassing you?" I kept my voice low, conscious of Sophie in the next room. "What about how you're treating our daughter? She needs help, Nolan, not criticism." He stepped closer, using his height to loom over me. "What she needs is to learn how to fit into this family properly. Just like you need to remember your place." Something about those words, "your place," hit differently this time. Maybe it was because earlier that day, I'd found some strange bank statements in Nolan's office while cleaning. Or maybe it was because I'd caught him in 3 lies this week alone about where he'd been after work. But standing there in our pristine kitchen, with its granite countertops and high-end appliances, I suddenly felt like I was suffocating. "My place," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "And where exactly is that, Nolan?" He smiled, that condescending smile I'd grown to hate. "Supporting your husband. Making our home run smoothly. Being grateful for everything I provide." He gestured around us. "This isn't exactly the life you could have on your own, is it?" Before I could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway. "Mom? Grandma says I should apologize for my behavior." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. Saw how she made herself smaller, how she tried so hard to disappear. Saw myself reflected in her eyes. "No, sweetheart," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "You have nothing to apologize for." Nolan's hand gripped my arm, hard enough to leave marks. "Marin." But something had shifted inside me. Like a switch being flipped, or maybe more like a dam finally breaking. I gently pulled away from his grip and walked over to Sophie, kneeling down to her level. "In fact," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think it's time some things changed around here." I didn't know it then, but that moment in the kitchen would be the beginning of a war. One that would either destroy everything I'd built my life around, or finally set us free. The morning after our disastrous dinner, I found Bernice in my kitchen, rearranging my cabinets. She didn't even look up when I walked in, just continued moving my coffee mugs to a different shelf with the precision of someone dismantling a bomb. "These really should be closer to the coffee maker, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Efficiency is everything when running a household." I stood there in my pajamas, watching her systematically undo every organizational system I'd created over the years. The kitchen was my space, or at least it had been. Now, like everything else in my life, it was being quietly taken over. "Where's Nolan?" I asked, reaching past her to retrieve a mug from its new location. "Oh, he left early for work. Something about an important meeting." She paused, studying me with those sharp eyes. "He mentioned you were quite emotional last night." I focused on making my coffee, trying to keep my hands steady. Did he mention why? Marin, she sighed, placing a hand on my arm. I know you mean well, but you need to understand how things work in this family. Nolan has worked so hard to give you and Sophie a beautiful life. The least you can do is make it easier for him. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the silence between us. I thought about the bank statements I'd found, about the late-night phone calls Nolan thought I couldn't hear, about Sophie's increasingly withdrawn behavior. And what exactly does making it easier look like, Bernice? She smiled, that same condescending smile Nolan had perfected. Well, for starters, this nonsense about Sophie needing therapy needs to stop. It's just attention-seeking behavior, and you're enabling it. Before I could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school. My heart clenched when I saw she'd picked out her most conservative outfit, the one she wore when trying to avoid criticism. "Gee, good morning," she said quietly. Bernice's lips tightened at the stutter. "Sophie, remember what we practiced? Take a deep breath and try again." I watched my daughter's shoulders tense, her small fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Something inside me snapped. "Sophie, honey, why don't you go get your backpack ready? I'll drive you to school today." "But Nolan usually," Bernice started. "I'm driving my daughter to school." I cut her off, my voice firm. "And while we're discussing family matters, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop rearranging my kitchen." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Bernice drew herself up, clutching her pearl necklace like a shield. "I see you're still in quite a state. Perhaps we should discuss this when Nolan gets home. Perhaps we should discuss why Nolan's been having secret meetings with someone named Marcus Reed." The name had been all over those bank statements, and judging by how quickly the color drained from Bernice's face, it meant something. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered. "Really?" "Because when I Googled him this morning, I found some interesting connections to failed investment schemes and fraud investigations." Bernice's hand trembled as she set down the mug she was holding. "You've been snooping through Nolan's private affairs?" "When those affairs affect my family, yes." We stared at each other across the kitchen island, years of unspoken tensions crackling between us. Finally, Bernice gathered her purse. "I think I should go," she said stiffly. "But Marin, be very careful about the accusations you make. You wouldn't want to jeopardize everything you have here." After she left, I found Sophie sitting on the stairs, her backpack clutched to her chest. "Is everything okay, Mom?" I knelt down beside her, noticing how she'd started biting her nails again, another habit Bernice and Nolan had tried to correct. "No, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But it will be." As we drove to school, I made 2 mental notes. First, to call my cousin Griffin, who worked in finance and might know something about Marcus Reed. And second, to start documenting everything. Every conversation, every bank statement, every subtle threat. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear. In this family, knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival. I never meant to overhear the conversation that would change everything. I was just dropping off some paperwork at Nolan's office, paperwork he'd forgotten at home for the 3rd time this month. But as I approached his door, I heard Bernice's voice, sharp and urgent. "Marcus is getting impatient, Nolan. He wants the rest of the money by Friday." I froze outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. "Mother, I told you I have it under control." Nolan's voice had that edge I knew too well, the one that appeared whenever his carefully constructed world started slipping. "Like you had it under control when you lost the first investment? Or when you borrowed against the house without telling Marin?" My stomach dropped. "The house. Our house." I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the folder to my chest. "Marin doesn't need to know anything," Nolan said. "She's been asking too many questions lately as it is. Getting ideas about Sophie needing therapy, wanting to go back to work. Well, we can't have that, can we?" Bernice's voice dripped with disdain. "The moment she gets financial independence, she'll realize she doesn't need you. And then what happens to our family? I know what I'm doing. Do you?" Because your wife was asking about Marcus Reed this morning, a sudden crash made me jump, something being thrown or knocked over. "She what?" Nolan's voice had gone deadly quiet. "Don't worry, I handled it. But you need to keep her busy, distracted. Remember what happened with your father when your first wife started getting too independent." I barely registered the rest of their conversation. First wife? Nolan had been married before? Footsteps approached the door. I ducked into the nearby bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Through the crack in the door, I watched Bernice leave, her heels clicking down the hallway. A few minutes later, Nolan emerged, running his hands through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now seemed like just another part of his performance. When I was sure they were gone, I slipped into his office. The place looked immaculate as always, except for a toppled photo frame on his desk, the one of our wedding day. As I picked it up, a business card fell from behind it. Marcus Reed, Investment Opportunities. I took a photo of the card with trembling hands, then noticed Nolan's laptop was still open. He never left it unlocked. Never. 5 minutes. That's all I needed. I found the emails quickly, dozens of them between Nolan and Marcus, discussing investment schemes and mounting losses. But it was an older email thread that made my blood run cold. It mentioned settlement payments to someone named Rachel Wilson. A quick social media search revealed what Bernice had let slip. Rachel Wilson was Nolan's ex-wife. The marriage had lasted less than a year, ending shortly after Nolan's father died. There were no photos of her after 2015. My phone buzzed by a text from Sophie's school. She'd had another anxiety attack during show and tell. I closed the laptop, my decision crystallizing. This wasn't just about me anymore. Every day I stayed in this marriage, every lie I pretended not to see, was teaching Sophie that this was what she deserved from life. As I left the office, I called my cousin Griffin. "Hey, stranger," he answered. "Everything okay?" "No," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice was. "I need your help. And I need you to not ask questions yet." "I'm listening." "What do you know about Marcus Reed?" The pause on the other end told me everything. "Marin," Griffin said carefully. "How do you know that name?" "Because my husband is involved with him. And I think..." I took a deep breath, watching Nolan's office building shrink in my rearview mirror. "I think I'm in trouble." "Don't do anything yet," Griffin said. "Meet me at the usual place in an hour." "And Marin? Delete this call from your phone." As I drove away, I realized I was smiling, not because I was happy, but because for the first time in years, I felt something else, powerful. They wanted to keep me dependent? Fine. Let them think they'd succeeded. The best revenge, after all, is the one they never see coming. Griffin was waiting for me at our old meeting spot, the rundown diner where we used to hide out during family gatherings when we were teenagers. He had that same worried look he wore back then, when I told him I was dropping out of law school to marry Nolan. "You look like hell," he said as I slid into the booth. "Thanks. You should see the other guy." I tried to smile, but my face wouldn't cooperate. The waitress brought us coffee without asking. Some places never change, even when everything else does. "So," Griffin said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Marcus Reed, you're not going to like what I found." I opened the envelope, spreading out documents that showed a pattern of failed investments, lawsuits, and settlements. But it was the newspaper clipping that made my hands shake. Local investment manager linked to domestic violence case. "Rachel Wilson," I whispered. Griffin's head snapped up. "How do you know that name?" "She was Nolan's first wife." I pushed my coffee away, suddenly nauseated. "What happened to her?" He pulled out his phone, showing me more articles. Rachel had filed domestic violence charges against someone, names redacted, then suddenly dropped them and moved across the country. The timing matched perfectly with her divorce from Nolan. "There's more," Griffin said quietly. "Marcus Reed? He's not just some shady investor. He's the guy who helps wealthy men hide their assets during divorces. Usually right before things get ugly." The diner's fluorescent lights seemed too bright suddenly. I could hear my pulse in my ears. "Marin." Griffin touched my arm. "Talk to me." "Sophie had another anxiety attack today," I said instead. "She can barely speak in public anymore. And Nolan. He just keeps saying she needs to try harder." "Like Rachel needed to try harder?" I flinched. Griffin had always been too good at connecting, so I was trying to ignore. "You need to meet Lydia Carson," he said. "She's not just a lawyer. She specializes in cases like this. She helped Rachel. Rachel survived? More than survived. She's the one who put me in touch with Lydia." He slid another business card across the table. but you need to be careful. If Nolan suspects anything. The diner's bell chimed. Bernice walked in, her designer purse clashing with the worn vinyl booths. Our eyes met, and I knew she'd followed me. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she said, approaching our table. "Family reunion?" I watched her take in the scattered documents, her perfectly manicured hand tightening on her purse strap. "Just catching up," Griffin said smoothly, gathering the papers. "You remember how close we were as kids?" "Of course." Bernice's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maren, dear, Nolan's been trying to reach you. Something about Sophie being upset at school again." My phone was still off. Smart move, tracking me through Sophie. "I should go," I said, standing. But Griffin caught my wrist. "Remember what we discussed about that investment opportunity," he said meaningfully. "The timing is critical." I nodded, understanding his real message. Act fast. Outside, Bernice linked her arm through mine, a gesture that looked friendly but felt like handcuffs. "You know," she said as we walked to our cars, "I've always admired how much you care about family. It would be terrible if anything threatened that. Stability." I thought about Sophie, about Rachel, about all the carefully constructed lies surrounding the Whitfield family. "You're right," I said, matching her tone. "Family is everything." She looked satisfied, probably thinking she'd put me in my place. She didn't notice me slipping Lydia's card into my pocket, or the way I'd angled my phone to record our entire conversation. Because that's the thing about being underestimated. It makes people careless. And I'd been underestimated long enough. As I drove home, I made two decisions. First, I would meet with Lydia Carson tomorrow. And second, I would start teaching Sophie that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't staying, it's knowing when to leave. The game was changing. And this time I was writing the rules. The call about my father's death came at 3 a.m. I hadn't spoken to him in 7 years, not since he missed my wedding, sending only a brief note saying he disapproved of my choices. Now here I was, standing in his study, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd tried to forget. "You shouldn't be here alone," Nolan had said when I told him I was going. "What will people think?" What people? The father who was dead, or the family I'd left behind? I picked up a framed photo from my father's desk, me at my law school graduation, before I met Nolan, before I became Mrs. Whitfield. My smile looked different then. Wider. Real. "I wondered if you'd come." I turned to find my old friend Kate in the doorway. We hadn't spoken since I'd ghosted her after the wedding, following Nolan's suggestions about appropriate friendships. "I almost didn't," I admitted. She stepped into the room, and I noticed the sharp suit, the confident stance. She'd made partner at her firm, the position I'd once dreamed of. "Your father talked about you," she said. "Near the end." "Did he?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. "What did he say?" "He said he should have fought harder. Should have told you what he knew about Nolan Whitfield." The photo frame slipped from my fingers, hitting the carpet with a soft thud. "What are you talking about?" Kate pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails. "Your father was on the board of directors at First National. 7 years ago, they investigated some suspicious transactions. Guess whose name came up?" My throat went dry. "Marcus Reed." Her head snapped up. "How do you?" "Kate." Griffin appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "Nolan's here." My heart stopped. "What?" "He said he had meetings all day." "Well, he's downstairs with Bernice, telling everyone how worried he is about his poor, emotionally fragile wife." Kate's eyes narrowed. "Emotionally fragile?" "It's his favorite narrative," I said bitterly. "Makes it easier to control me." "Like he controlled Rachel?" Kate asked quietly. The room went still. Griffin cursed under his breath. "You knew," I whispered. "All this time." "Your father knew," Kate said. "He tried to warn you, but Nolan had already isolated you. Then Rachel disappeared, and the investigation just went away." Footsteps on the stairs. Nolan's voice drifting up, perfectly modulated to sound concerned. Kate quickly transferred files to my phone. "Everything your father collected. Bank records, police reports, Rachel's original statement." "Maren." Nolan's voice closer now. "Darling, are you up here?" Griffin moved to the door. "I'll stall him." "Wait," I grabbed Kate's arm. "What happened to Rachel?" "Really? She's alive. Protected. And ready to talk if you need her." Nolan appeared in the doorway, all sympathetic smiles and worried eyes. There you are. I've been so concerned. He noticed Kate, his smile flickering for just a moment. Katie, isn't it? From law school. It's Catherine now. Partner at Morris and Chen. She handed me her card, holding my gaze. Call me. Anytime. After she left, Nolan wrapped an arm around my shoulders, a gesture that once felt protective but now felt like a warning. You shouldn't be here alone, he murmured. Let's get you home. Home. Where Sophie was waiting with Bernice. Where every room held cameras I wasn't supposed to know about. Where Rachel had once lived, thinking she was safe. Actually, I said, I need a minute. To say goodbye. He hesitated, then nodded magnanimously. Of course. I'll wait downstairs. Once he was gone, I looked around my father's study one last time, at the life he'd tried to warn me about, at the truth he died protecting. I took the graduation photo from its broken frame and slipped it into my purse, along with Kate's card. Then I walked downstairs to my husband, already planning my next move. Because now I knew this wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about justice. For Rachel. For my father. For Sophie. And justice, I was learning, sometimes looks a lot like revenge. I should have known Nolan would make his move the moment I showed any sign of independence. The morning after my father's funeral, I woke up to find my phone disconnected and my car keys missing. Simple, effective tactics, ones I might not have recognized before learning about Rachel. It's for your own good, Nolan said over breakfast, watching me try my dead phone again. You're not thinking clearly, darling. Grief can do strange things to people. Sophie sat between us, pushing her cereal around, her eyes darting between our faces like she was watching a tennis match. Where's Grandma? She asked, her stutter barely noticeable when she was with just us. She'll be here soon, Nolan smiled. In fact, we've been talking about sending you to stay with her for a while. Wouldn't that be nice? My spoon clattered against the bowl. What? Just until you're feeling more stable. He reached across the table, touching my hand. I fought the urge to pull away. We're all worried about you, Marin. The way you've been acting, the secret meetings. And Mom. Sophie's voice trembled. It's okay, sweetheart, I said, but Nolan cut me off. No, it's not okay. Your mother needs help, Sophie. Professional help. And while she gets better, you'll be safe with Grandma. The front door opened, Bernice's signature perfectly timed entrance. But this time she wasn't alone. A man in a white coat followed her in. Dr. Phillips is here to help, Bernice announced, her concern as perfectly crafted as her appearance. We've all noticed the changes, dear. The paranoia, the accusations about Nolan's business. I stood up so fast my chair toppled backward. You're not taking my daughter. Mrs. Whitfield, the doctor stepped forward. Your family is concerned about your mental state. These delusions about your husband. They're not delusions. I backed away, reaching for Sophie. Tell them about Rachel, I said to Nolan. Tell them about Marcus Reed and the missing money. You see, Bernice touched the doctor's arm. She's been fixating on Nolan's ex-wife, imagining conspiracies. Because they're real. I pulled out my phone, forgetting it was dead. All the evidence. All my father's files, trapped in a useless piece of metal. Marin. Nolan's voice was gentle, reasonable, the voice that had made me doubt myself for years. Think about Sophie. Do you want her to see you like this? Sophie was crying now, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. I knew that look. It was the same one I'd seen in old photos of Rachel. The doctor took another step forward. Mrs. Whitfield, if you'll just come with me. No. I grabbed Sophie's hand. We're leaving. Security, Bernice called out. Two men appeared in the doorway, private security, not hospital orderlies. Of course. Nolan always planned everything perfectly. Mom. Sophie's grip tightened on my hand. I don't want to go with Grandma. I looked at my daughter, then at the men blocking our escape, at Nolan's practiced concern and Bernice's triumphant smile, at the doctor with his commitment papers, ready to label me unstable, unfit, just like they'd probably done to Rachel. 7 years of carefully constructed control, all leading to this moment. Okay, I said quietly. You're right. I need help. Nolan's relief looked almost genuine. It's for the best, darling. I knelt down to Sophie's level, wiping her tears. Remember what we read in your book? About the princess who pretended to give up. Her eyes widened slightly. She was always so quick to understand. Sometimes, I continued loud enough for everyone to hear, we have to take a step back to move forward. Very wise. The doctor nodded approvingly. I stood up, letting them think they'd won. Let them think I was broken. But as they led me out to the waiting car, I caught Sophie's eye one last time. She wasn't crying anymore. Instead, she had that look, the one she got when solving puzzles. The one that said she understood. Sometimes surrender is just another word for preparation. They thought they were writing the ending to my story. They didn't realize it was just the beginning of their own undoing. 3 days in the psychiatric facility taught me more about patience than 7 years of marriage ever did. They thought the medication was making me compliant. They didn't know I'd learned that trick from Sophie, holding pills under your tongue until no one's watching. When Nolan came to visit, his concern was picture perfect. The doctors say you're doing better, he said, sitting across from me in the sterile visiting room. More? Rational. I gave him the smile he wanted to see, docile, grateful. I've had time to think. That's wonderful, darling. He reached for my hand. I let him take it, remembering Rachel's police report. He's most dangerous when he thinks he's won. Bernice says Sophie's doing so well. Her stutter's almost gone. My fingers twitched in his grip. He noticed. He always noticed. It's temporary, he added quickly. Once you're better. I know about Marcus Reed's latest investment scheme, I said quietly. His hand went rigid around mine. In the corner, the security camera's red light blinked steadily. You're confused, he said, but his eyes darted to the door. $20 million, I continued. Borrowed against assets you don't own. Did you really think my father wouldn't leave me proof? Marin. The SEC is very interested in those transactions. So is Rachel's lawyer. He released my hand like it burned him. You're having another episode. No, I smiled, reaching into my robe pocket. I'm having a meeting. The door opened. Griffin walked in, followed by Lydia Carson and 2 FBI agents. What is this? Nolan stood, his carefully constructed facade cracking. Justice, I said, standing too. Or maybe revenge. I'm still deciding. You can't. Actually, she can. Lydia stepped forward. Mrs. Whitfield has been working with us from inside this facility. Every conversation recorded, every visitor logged. Including Bernice, Griffin added. She was very chatty about Rachel once the FBI explained her potential liability. Nolan's face contorted, that flash of rage I'd seen so many times before, quickly masked by confusion. This is ridiculous. My wife is unwell. Your wife, I cut in, just spent 3 days gathering evidence while you thought she was sedated. Turns out my law degree wasn't completely wasted after all. The agents moved forward. Nolan backed away, looking around wildly. You don't understand. I did everything for our family. No, I said. You did everything for control. Sophie's stutter, my instability, it was all about keeping us dependent. Afraid. Like Rachel. Griffin asked. Nolan lunged, not at the agents, but at me. 7 years of suppressed rage finally breaking through his perfect mask. But I was ready. Had been ready since I found those bank statements. Since I learned about Rachel. Since I saw my own fear reflected in Sophie's eyes. I stepped aside. He stumbled past me, right into the agent's waiting arms. Marin, he pleaded as they cuffed him, his voice hitting that tender note that used to make me doubt myself. Think about Sophie. I said. That's why I recorded everything. So when she's older, she'll know exactly why we left. As they led him away, Lydia handed me a folder. Custody papers, restraining order, and evidence of financial fraud. Bernice is already singing to avoid charges. You're free. Free. Such a simple word for such a complicated feeling. Sophie, I asked Griffin. Safe with Kate. Away from Bernice. I nodded, my legs suddenly shaky. Griffin caught my arm. You okay? I looked around the room where I'd planned my family's salvation while pretending to be broken. Where I'd finally understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to fight back. No, I said honestly. But I will be. As we walked out, my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Thank you. R. Rachel. The woman whose story had helped me rewrite my own. I typed back, "No. Thank you." Because that's the thing about revenge. Sometimes it's not about getting even. Sometimes it's about making sure the story ends differently for the next person. Sometimes justice and vengeance are just different words for healing. And Sophie and I, we had a lot of healing to do. 6 months after Nolan's arrest, I found myself standing in my father's study again. The room felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the heavy oak furniture and wall of legal books. Or maybe I was the one who was different. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through old photos. Her therapy sessions were paying off. She barely stuttered anymore, except when she was excited. Like now. "Mom, look at this one." She held up a picture of me in court, from my first case as a public defender. "You look so strong." "She still does," Griffin said from the doorway. "Maybe even stronger now." I was about to respond when my phone buzzed, a text from Kate. Nolan took the plea deal. 15 years. Bernice agreed to testify. Sophie looked up, reading my expression. "Is it about Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart." I sat beside her, remembering all those parenting books that said honesty was best. "He's going to be away for a long time." She nodded, surprisingly calm. "Because of the bad things he did to you?" "And to Rachel. Among other things." I touched the photo in her hands. "But that's not what we're focusing on now, is it?" "No," she smiled. "We're focusing on your new job. Can I come see your office at the Women's Center?" "Tomorrow, I promised." After we finish unpacking, Griffin cleared his throat. "Speaking of which, there's someone here to see you." Bernice stood in the hallway, looking smaller somehow without her designer clothes and perfect makeup. She held a cardboard box. "I found these," she said quietly, "in Nolan's storage unit. I thought Sophie might want them." Inside the box were photo albums, baby clothes, drawings, memories Nolan had hidden away, trying to control even our past. "Why now?" I asked. Bernice's hands twisted together, a gesture so like Sophie's that it hurt. "I've been seeing someone. A therapist. She's helping me understand patterns, cycles." She looked at Sophie, then back at me. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just understanding, maybe. About fear and what it makes us do." I thought about Rachel's last text. Sometimes the strongest chains are the ones we forge ourselves. "Sophie," I said, "why don't you show Grandma your new art room?" As they walked away, I heard Sophie chattering about her paintings, about her therapy sessions, about how she was learning to be brave. Bernice listened, really listened, maybe for the first time. Griffin touched my shoulder. "You okay?" "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust her," I admitted. "Maybe that's not the point," he said. "Maybe it's about breaking cycles, not fixing everything." I looked around the study, my study now. My father's last gift, along with the evidence that helped free me. On the desk sat a framed photo of Sophie and me at her first art show last month. Beside it, a business card for the Women's Center where I'd be starting work next week, helping others find their way out of situations like mine. The doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw Rachel standing on the porch, our first meeting in person after months of texts and calls. She looked different than her photos, stronger maybe. Or maybe that's just what freedom does to people. "Ready?" Griffin asked. I picked up Sophie's latest drawing from my desk, a family portrait that included Griffin, Rachel, Kate, and yes, even Bernice. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, "My real family." "You know what?" I said. "I think I am." Because that's the thing about revenge and justice and healing. They're not endpoints but doorways. What matters isn't just getting through them, but what you choose to build on the other side. Sophie's laughter drifted down the hallway, mixed with Bernice's quieter tones. Outside, Rachel waited to help plan the center's new legal clinic. And here, in my father's study that had become mine, I finally understood. Sometimes the happy ending isn't about everything being perfect. Sometimes it's just about being free to write your own story. And ours? It was just beginning.